Thrust Tumansky R-29-300 with thrust to spare at aircraft top speed of Mach 2.4.20. It also had a fast acceleration time, taking 3-4 seconds to go from mile to full power, and took less than a second to ignite the afterburner. 15. The aircraft's placarded top speed was set by cockpit canopy structural strength. 21. The engine intake had louvers which supplied the environmental control system with air to keep the avionics and pilot cool. 20. Similar to early examples of the F-4 Phantom's J-79 engine, the R-29 would generate smoke when operating without the afterburner. 15. The engine outer cases ran very hot, which sometimes triggered false fire alarms. Moreover, the engine was good for only a couple of hundred sorties at most before requiring replacement. 22. This was partly because Russian engines were designed to last about 150 hours before being replaced. 23. It was also a way to generate income from export customers by selling them new engines in exchange for hard currency. 24. Changing an engine was difficult because the aircraft had to be separated in the middle. 14. The engine was also a weak point on early models of the MiG-23 as it was not stressed for high yaw maneuver loads. If the fighter entered a spin, the engine shaft could bend. Compressor blades would rub, sending debris into the turbine, causing turbine blades to break off, destroying the engine. Introduction of R-29B300 addressed this design deficiency. 20. Fuel. The prototype version of the MiG-23 carried 3 fuel tanks in the fuselage, with capacities of 1,920, 820 and 710 liters respectively. Additionally, each wing carried 3 integral fuel tanks of 62.5, 137.5 and 200 liters. The number 2 fuel tank in the fuselage also functioned as the aircraft's carry-through wing box and waist, welded together with thick plates of VNS2 steel alloy. 25. The MiG-23 edition 1971 redesign allowed for a 4th tank carrying 470 liters to be fitted in the rear of the fuselage. 10. This fuel capacity gave the MiG-23 better endurance than a clean F-4, carrying no drop tanks. If traveling at the MiG-23's endurance speed of 230 knots, an individual sortie could be stretched out to an hour, though. If the afterburner was used, it could fall down to around 45 minutes or less. 26. Introduced with the MiG-23M were plumbed pylons under the movable wing panels, which could be fitted with 800-liter drop tanks, though these could only be carried with the wings at full spread and had to be jettisoned otherwise. 11. And a third 800-liter drop tank could be carried under the fuselage on the MiG-23ML. 12. Early models of the MiG-23 ran into problems with the plane's number 2 fuel tank suffering structural failures, which were especially problematic as the tanks were integral to the structure rather than contained within a fuel bladder. This meant that as the structure developed hairline fractures, fuel would seep out. Thighs eventually forced severe G-force limits until a solution could be found. Prior to quality being improved in later models, one fix was to weld a plate on the inside surface and a stiffener on the outer skin. 16. 10. Performance tests. Most potential enemies of the USSR and its client states have had opportunities to evaluate the MiG-23's performance. In the summer of 1977, after a political realignment by its government, Egypt provided a number of MiG-23 MSs and MiG-23 BNS to the United States. These were evaluated under a pair of exploitation programs codenamed HAVPAD and HAVBOXER respectively. These and other MiGs, including additional MiG-23s acquired from other sources, were used as part of a secret training program known as Project Constant Peg to familiarize American pilots with Soviet aircraft. 23. Additionally, a Cuban pilot flew a MiG-23BN to the US in 1991, and a Libyan MiG-23 pilot also defected to Greece in 1981. In both cases, the aircraft were later repatriated. 27. Initially, American intelligence on the MiG-23 assumed that the fighter could turn well and had reasonable acceleration capability, but testing during HAVPAD proved this assumption to be incorrect. While its turning capability was comparable to an original F-4E Phantom, newer American fighters like the F-15 Eagle or F-4E upgraded with slats could easily outturn the MiG-23 in a dogfight. In fact, whenever the MiG-23 approached high angle of attack, it became very unstable and liable to depart control at flight. 28-15. Conversely, the MiG-23's acceleration capability was tremendous, particularly at low altitudes, below 10,000 feet, 3,000 m, and crossing the sound barrier, where it could out-accelerate any American fighter. 28-15. The fighter's small profile gave it the advantage of being hard to spot visually as well. Overall, HAVPAD testing determined that the MiG-23, while a poor dogfighter, made for a good interceptor capable of performing hit-and-run attacks. Despite its limitations, in the hands of a very capable pilot, the MiG-23 represented a serious threat in air combat. 28-15. Test pilots who flew the MiG-23 as part of constant PEG came to similar conclusions about the MiG-23 being an effective interceptor rather than a dogfighter, but were more critical of the planes they flew. Among their complaints was that the MiG-23's airframe was too easily overstressed, that it was unstable in yaw as it passed the sound barrier and again when approaching Mach 2. That its narrow landing gear, although designed to be used on unprepared surfaces, tended to slip and slide in adverse weather conditions, and because it sat low to the ground, it could more easily suck debris into its engine intakes. 20. In general, the MiG-23 was unpopular with the American pilots because it was so dangerous to fly. 16. Among the nicknames the constant PEG pilots had for the MiG-23 was the looping hog because it flew like a pig, and one of the few basic fighter maneuvers, BFM, it could pull off in a dogfight was a massive loop. If going fast enough, a MiG-23 could easily perform a loop for me, 6.4 kilometers high, that other planes would struggle to follow, at the bottom of which it would cut back inside them and proceed to fly off until outside their visual range so it could come back in again. The only other BFM the MiG-23 could perform, according to Col. Ret. John Saxman, was the no-circle fight. As the two aircraft approached and passed close by each other, the MiG-23, instead of trying to turn one way or the other with the enemy aircraft, as in a one-circle or two-circle fight, would speed on ahead until it could come back into the fight from a different angle. 29. The MiG-23's deficits and qualities were also recognized by Allied air forces which received the fighter from the Soviet Union, including the East German Air Force. I spent a lot of time in Berlin watching GCI tapes to verify we were flying the right tactics, and it became clear to me that the East Germans knew exactly what the MiG-23's limitations were. They knew that since it was unmaneuverable, they had to attack from many different directions as fast as possible. It was sophisticated, and they were going to overwhelm us if we ever went up against them. I sat down with some analysts and linguists and listened to what pilots were saying to their GCI controllers, and I actually started to respect them for what they were doing with a very limited asset. Commander, Ret. Marty Macy, 4477 TH Test and Evaluation Squadron, 29. The pilots of Constant PEG sought to teach these and other aspects of the MiG-23 to the frontline tactical air command squadrons, nicknamed Blue Air, against whom they trained. We taught the guys that if you were defensive with a flogger right behind you, then you were automatically offensive, because even the worst pilot in the world would be able to deny him shot. You would turn, he would try and turn with you, but he would never be able to turn the same corner as you. Col. Ret. Paco Gaisler, 4477 th Test and Evaluation Squadron, 29. One of the MiG-23s would retreat while the other guy would come in behind you. In their training environment, the Blue Air pilots would do their intercepts at 350 to 400 knots, so when they all of a sudden get this flogger coming at Mach 1.5, it really changes the geometry of things. It blows your mind because you are not used to seeing that kind of speed. LT Col. USMC Ret. Lenny Bucko, 4477 th Test and Evaluation Squadron, 29. The MiG-23's speed in particular was used as a teaching aid for a couple of situations during a potential war with the Soviet Union. The first was at low altitudes to demonstrate its ability to run down any NATO or American strike aircraft, barring the late model F-111F Aardvark, which would be attempting to go low and fast to penetrate Soviet territory. The second was to simulate the MiG-25 Foxbat, a high, fast flyer which would be going after high-value targets such as aerial refueling or airborne early warning and control aircraft like the E-3 Sentry. 29. The early MiG-23M series was also used to test the American Northrop F-5s captured by the North Vietnamese and sent to the former USSR for evaluation. The Soviets acknowledged the F-5 was a veritable aircraft, and at some speeds and altitudes better than the MiG-23M, one of the main reasons the MiG-23MLD and MiG-29 developments were started. These tests allowed the Russians to make modifications to several of their fourth-generation aircraft. The MiG-23, however, was not designed to combat F-5s, or weakness reflected by early MiG-23 variants. 30. Dutch pilot Leon van Mora, who had more than 1,200 hours flying F-16s, flew against MiG-23MLs from air bases in Germany and the US as part of NATO's aerial mock combat training with Soviet equipment. He concluded the MiG-23ML was superior in the vertical to early F-16 variants, just slightly inferior to the F-16 in the horizontal, and had superior BVR capability. 31. The Soviet Combat Manual. For MiG-23 pilots claims the MiG-23M to have a slight superiority over the F-4 and KFIR, and describes combat history involving Syrian MiG-23MFs versus Israeli F-15 and F-16s, which it labels successful. This manual also commends tactics to be used against these fighters. 32. Operational history. Western and Russian aviation historians usually differ in respect to combat record for their military vehicles and doctrines, part due to the bias in favor of their respective national industries and academies. They also usually accept claims going along with their respective political views, since usually many conflicting and contradictory reports are written and accepted by their respective historians. 33, 34, 35. Before recent years, with widespread use of hand-portable cameras, little pictorial evidence could be published about specific losses and victories of the different combat systems, with a limited number of losses and victories confirmed by both parties. 36. Soviet and Warsaw Pact. The MiG-23 was first officially commissioned into the Soviet Air Forces, VVS, on the 4th of January, 1974. But even before its mass introduction, there had been many teething problems with the brand new fighter. Stability issues and limited maneuverability resulted in numerous flight restrictions placed on the fighter. Efforts to rectify these concerns began in the mid-1970s. Despite numerous updates, These restrictions would only be partially lifted with the introduction of the MiG-23 MLD. Still, the large number of MiG-23s deployed in Central Europe represented a sufficiently potent threat in a possible war with the West. 37. MiG-23M. Although many MiG-23 pilots were disappointed to discover their fighter would lose in a turning engagement with the MiG-21, the MiG-23 gave the VVS capabilities which the MiG-21 simply lacked, particularly as a high-energy fighter with BVR missiles. However, throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Soviet pilots continued to train and operate the MiG-23 in the same inflexible manner as the MiG-21, a high-speed point defense interceptor closely guided by GCI. It was not until the widespread introduction of the MiG-23 MLD that Soviet pilots began to utilize the MiG-23 as a true air superiority fighter. 37. By the 1980s, the MiG-23's accident rate in the VVS averaged 12.5 losses per 100,000 flying hours. This was often worse in the air forces of the Warsaw Pact allies. 24.3 major mishaps per 100,000 flying hours in the Hungarian Air Force, 20.4 losses per 100,000 flying hours in the East German Air Force, 18 losses per 100,000 flying hours in the Bulgarian Air Force, and 11.3 losses per 100,000 flying hours in the Polish Air Force. 38. By 1990, over 1,500 MiG-23s of different models were in service with the VVS and the VPVO. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new Russian Air Force began to cut back its fighter force, and it was decided that the single-engine MiG-23s and MiG-27s were to be retired to operational storage. The last model to serve was the MiG-23P air defense variant. It was retired on the 1st of May 1998. 39. When East and West Germany unified, no MiG-23s were transferred to the German Air Force, but 12 former East German MiG-23s were supplied to the United States. When Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the Czechs received all the MiG-23s, which were retired in 1998. Hungary retired its MiG-23s in 1996, Poland in 1999, Romania in 2000, and Bulgaria in 2004. The MiG-23 was the Soviet Air Force's Top Gun equivalent aggressor aircraft from the late 1970s to the late 1980s. It proved a difficult opponent for early MiG-29 variants flown by inexperienced pilots. Exercises showed when well flown, a MiG-23 MLD could achieve favorable kill ratios against the MiG-29 in mock combat by using hit-and-run tactics and not engaging the MiG-29s in dogfights. Usually the aggressor MiG-23 MLDs had a shark mouth painted on the nose just aft of the radome, and many were piloted by Soviet-Afghan war veterans. In the late 1980s, these aggressor MiG-23s were replaced by MiG-29s, also featuring shark mouths. 40. Soviet-Afghan War. Soviet MiG-23s were used over Afghanistan, often being used to escort missions close to the borders of Pakistan and Iran, as the MiG-21 lacked the necessary range to do so. Some of them were claimed to have been shot down. The earliest use of the MiG-23 in Afghanistan occurred in April 1982, when aircraft of the 152nd IAP escorted a large air raid against Rabati Jali in Nimruz province. This developed into a disaster when the MiG-23s failed to provide adequate air cover and the strike force accidentally crossed into Iran, losing several helicopters to Iranian F-4 Phantoms. Soviet and Afghan MiG-23s and Pakistani F-16s clashed a few times during the Soviet-Afghan War from 1987. 2 MiG-23 were claimed shot down by Pakistani F-16s when crossing the border, 41. They both were not confirmed, 42, while one F-16 was shot down on the 29th of April, 1987. Western, 43, source